Hello and welcome to screencast number 5, and in this screencast we're going to look at depleting our fossil fuel reserves and the impact that that could have. We're going to discuss a term or a nickname called peak oil and what this peak oil means in terms of our oil reserves. And then we may even get a chance to talk about what happens if we end up with too much fossil fuel energy because of alternatives. So let's start with that. We know that fossil fuels are non-renewable, and because of that, as we use them, the amount available is going to decline. Scientists are saying that we've used about 1.1 trillion barrels of oil, which they predict that that's about almost half of our reserves that we have. They believe that there's about 1 trillion barrels of proven reserves that remain. And these proven reserves include the oil sands in Canada and Venezuela. And when we include the oil reserves from Canada and Venezuela, that gives us about 1.6 trillion barrels. So to estimate how long this remaining oil will last, analysts will calculate the reserves to production ratio that you see here. Reserves to production ratio, or R divided by P, is the amount of the total remaining reserves divided by the annual rate of production. So it's the extraction and the processing that we go through. At the current level of production, there's 30 billion barrels globally that are being produced per year. That's 1.6 trillion barrels that will last, in just oil, are predicted to last about 54 more years. So in your lifetime you might see oil just totally disappear because we've used it all. When we apply the reserves to production ratio to natural gas, we find that the world's proven reserves of this resource would last about 64 more years. Okay, so we're going to add 64 more years to that. And then for coal, the RP ratio is estimated at 112 years for that. And this true number of years for the fuel may be less than the figures suggest, because right now at our current demand we are increasing the need. So it's not constant, it's not at a constant level. Yet at the same time, these true numbers of years may even be more than the figures suggest, because proven reserves tend to increase as technology becomes more powerful and as market prices rise. And also we have to consider alternative fuel sources, clean fuel sources that we are using, turbines and hydroelectric, that could also change the demand for that. Mining for oil sands, let me go, if it lets me go ahead. Hello. Went too far. All right. So when we mine for oil sands and hydraulic fracturing for natural gas in the recent years, this has increased the proven reserves of these fuels in North America substantially. It has advanced in oil and gas extraction in the United States in the past several years, and it's been so great that the International Energy Agency in 2012 predicted a resurgence would make the United States the world's biggest oil producer into the 2020s. So we're one of the biggest now. But regardless of how many years worth of resource we might calculate to be left, we are a society that is dependent on that resource, and because of that we will face crisis when the last bit is extracted from the ground. So that's what we're looking for or towards. Production of the resource tends to decline once reserves are depleted halfway, and this is past production of the peak. If the demand for the resource holds steady or it continues to increase while production declines, then this will create a shortage. Scientists and economists are very anxious about this phenomena with oil, and the scenario that they have developed, they have nicknamed peak oil because we have already used roughly half of the Earth's conventional oil reserves, and they believe a peak oil crisis may well be in our very near future. Obviously, we face some challenges. So to understand these concerns about peak oil, we need to turn back the clock and go back to 1956. During this year, shale oil geologist M. King Hubert had calculated that the U.S. oil production would peak around 1970. Because of his prediction, in the 1970s there was an oil crisis or an energy crisis that we went through. The United States was in complete panic that there would not be enough gasoline. This caused long lines at gas stations, fighting. People got shot. I mean, it was really, really ridiculous. There were satire type songs that came out as a result of it. So there was a lot that was happening behind the scenes with this. But I digress. So his prediction was ridiculed at the time, and I think you can understand why, but it proved to be accurate. The U.S. production peaked in that very year and has fallen since then. The peak in the production became known as Hubert's peak. In 1974, Hubert analyzed the data on technology and the economics and geology, and predicted that global oil production would peak in 1995. It grew past 1995, but many scientists using newer data today predicted that at some point in the coming decade, production would begin to decline. Luckily, discoveries of new oil fields peaked 30 years ago, and since then we've been extracting and consuming more oil than we have been discovering. So let's take a look at these two graphics. A represents Hubert's prediction of peak oil in the United States. We're going to discuss that, and the modern prediction of peak oil production. So let's take a look at Hubert's. The peak oil describes a peak in production. So the U.S. oil production did peak in 1970. So we can see this is roughly 1970. We can actually see that peak, just as geologist M. King Hubert had predicted. Since then, success in Alaska and in the Gulf of Mexico and with secondary extraction has enhanced the production during the decline. So note that the curves shift to the right and the peaks increase in height as more fuel is discovered. So here's the shift and the peaks increasing in height. Today's U.S. oil production is spiking upward as deep offshore drilling and hydraulic fracturing make new deposits accessible. Still, some analysts believe global oil production will soon peak. So here's what we look at as far as the modern prediction is concerned. This is one recent projection, and it's dated from 2011, that the analysis by scientists at the Association for the Study of Peak Oil shows, here we are, that we're all going to start to go down by 2050. Our natural gas, our polar oils, our deep water oil, everything is going to take a decline by 2050. Discovery or development of wholly new sources of oil can delay the peak by boosting our overall proven reserves. This is what is happening as we exploit Canada's oil sands. People are counting on a series of new sources in the future. They tend to believe that we can continue relying on oil for a long time, and this may indeed turn out to be the case. We just don't know. At some point, we will reach peak oil, and we will reach peak gas, and we will reach peak coal. The question is when. We just don't know when. Whether we will be prepared to deal with the resulting challenges, that's another question that exists. Predicting an exact date for peak oil is difficult. There's a lot of variables that are at play. Companies and governments do not reveal the true data on their oil reserves. That's one factor. Estimates differ as to how much oil we can extract secondarily from existing deposits. There was a recent U.S. geological survey that reported an estimate of 2 trillion barrels of conventional oil remaining in the world, rather than the 1 trillion that we previously discussed. There are some estimates that predict still greater amounts of oil available. There was a 2007 report by the U.S. General Accounting Office that reviewed 21 studies and found that most estimates for the timing of the oil production peak ranged from now through the year 2040. So we could even experience it within the next couple of years. But whenever it occurs, the divergence of supply and demand could have a momentous economic and social and political consequence that will profoundly affect our lives. There is a prophet or peak oil writer by the name of James Howard Kunstler. You might have heard of him. And he has sketched a very frightening scenario of our post-peak world during what he calls the long emergency. And this long emergency is where we lack cheap oil with which we use to transport goods long distances. And he looks at today's globalized economy, and he said that could collapse into a large number of isolated and intensely localized economies. He predicts that large cities would require urban agriculture to feed their residents, and there would be fewer petroleum-based fertilizers and pesticides. That means that we could only feed only a fraction of the world's 7 billion people. And his concern is that the American suburbs would be hit particularly hard because of their dependence on the automobile to go to work. So he paints a really dark picture, but there are more optimistic observers that argue that the oil supplies, even if they do dwindle, and even though prices will rise, it will create powerful incentives for businesses and governments and individuals to conserve energy and to develop alternative energy sources. And these developments, they think, will save us from major disruptions. So these are just some of the predictions that we have. So we can see that there's a lot of different variables that are going on. Okay, we're going to end the screencast a little bit early. We will continue with could we end up with too much fossil fuel energy in the next screencast. So see you on the other side.